We now introduce our first speakers, Professor Jeff Hughes. Professor Hughes is the current editor-in-chief of the journal, famous journal, Emergency Medicine Australasia Journal. He's also an associate professor and director of critical care services at the Royal Adelaide Hospital in Australia. Without further delay, would you please join us in welcoming Professor Hughes? Professor Hughes, please.
Well, good morning to you all, and can I just say what a pleasure it is to be able to present to you at your symposium. And I was saying earlier to the others that my wife and I have been to Hong Kong several times over the years, and we have very fond memories of what is a wonderful city. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I will just talk briefly about my journal background, not my clinical professional background. I first became editor of the British journal, the Emergency Medicine Journal, in 2006. And I had that role for 8 years. And then I took over as editor of the Australasian journal, the EMA, at the start of 2014, and I'm now in my 9th year. And for 4 years, I was on the editorial board of the British Medical Journal. And so I suppose in summary, I've had nearly 17 years of being an editor and have done it for a Northern Hemisphere journal and a Southern Hemisphere journal. Now, in my time as being interested in journals, I've had 3 major influences, really, who have had a big impact on me. The first one, a very famous editor of the British Medical Journal, Richard Smith. He was very charismatic, very innovative, and did a lot of interesting stuff as an editor. And then also his successor, Fiona Godley, who was just retired as editor of the British Medical Journal. And it was during her time that I was on the editorial board of the journal and got to meet Fiona. And the two of them have been very significant influences for me on what a journal is. And the third person I like to mention is Tim Albert. Tim Albert is non-medical. He used to be a journalist for London British newspapers. And his influence on me was about writing. And when I first qualified as an emergency physician, and I was in the UK, Tim had a 3-day writing course for specialists, and he taught doctors how to write properly. And he also ran a training course for editors. And when I first became editor of the British journal, the EMJ, I was sent off to his course to learn the basics of editing. And Tim was a very significant influence again, because although he was non-medical, he had the ideas of what made a good journal. And so those 3 people I think of a lot, really, as powerful influences. Just see if we go to the next slide. Here we go. Regarding his editor's course, Richard Smith of the BMJ did stress the importance of it. And ideally, anybody who becomes an editor would be exposed to some sort of training. And it's a lot of people who become an editor do it either because nobody else wants to do it, or they want to do it, but they don't have any exposure to training. And I was very fortunate to go to Tim's course held near London, and it was fantastic. It was seriously, seriously stimulating. Now, our journal, or my journal now, the Emergency Medicine Australasia, is published every 2 months, 6 issues a year. Now, you may not realize it, but there are at least 30,000 medical journals in the world. Most of them are in English, and most of them are specialist journals. There are a few which are general journals, but you know, we are just one of over 30,000 journals, and it's well to bear that in mind when we're thinking about publishing. It's a very significant number. And one of the most fun journals I've ever come across, it was when I did the editor's course. It was called Polar Medicine, and it was written purely around healthcare and public health and being a doctor in the Arctic or the Antarctic. And I just thought that was terrific, such a very specialized journal. And I subscribed to it for a year because I was just fascinated by it, really. And I think that's one of the most wonderfully specialist journals I've come across, really. This journal, EMA, it's a specialist journal, and it's not a newsletter. And I'll come back to that shortly. But a journal is not a place where you publish diary appointments or items about meetings or things like that. That is a newsletter. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about a general journal, and I'm going to take the BMJ as an example, as that's the one I know best. And the BMJ, this is a summary of their mission statement. They have 6 broad categories of their mission. Obviously, research is top of the list, but it's not just a research journal. It's a magazine for the members. By that, it means basically anybody who subscribes to it, but in particular the British medical profession. It's also a think tank. It stimulates thought. It creates and challenges conventional thinking. It's a campaigner, particularly with investigating what we might say irregular practice. It's also an educational resource. And also, and this is an important concept for a journal, that the reader sees it as a trusted and inspiring friend. So I think when we're looking at a general journal, bearing in mind it's not just about research. And I don't get the BMJ subscribed anymore as a print copy, but when it used to come through the post every week, seeing it in the letterbox, it did feel like a trusted and inspiring friend was waiting to be read. And so very important to think outside the square about what a journal can be. But the question is, can you say that about a specialist journal? And I think you can. When I took over the Australasian journal, I was very much bearing in mind the BMJ model and whether you could apply that in some way to a specialist journal. And I think it's possible to do that. And so I've done where I've slowly moved the Australasian journal is I've tried to make it a mixture of research and then a combination of being a magazine, a think tank, a campaigner, and what educational resource. And I have in mind very crudely that about 50% of the journal is towards research or the academic side, and about 50% covers everything else, which is the magazine, the challenging thinking, investigating, campaigning type things like that. Now, you might say, how could a specialty journal, for example, be a campaigner? Well, these are 5 covers from previous editions of the journal, and they're all relevant to emergency medicine. So you can campaign gently about an issue within this. So that on the left, this is quite a few years old now, but I was approached by some people if they could write something about gender equality and relevant to emergency medicine, and we did, and I wrote an editorial about it. The next one is not so much campaigning, but more promotion. And we have made a distinct policy of the journal to support the development of the specialty in the Pacific region, the Pacific Islands, up to Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. And as long as the articles are of a good enough quality, then we promote the development of the specialty in those countries. And that second cover shows that. We put it on the front cover. And a very clear message that we were promoting Pacific health, really. The middle one was about e-scooters. As you know, they are a particular injury hazard. And for the editorial, I was able to get an expert in transport and traffic statistics and epidemiology to write the editorial about e-scooters. This is gentle campaigning. This is not sort of angry campaigning, it's gentle nudge campaigning. The next one is about New Zealand, and we published a paper essentially about racism against Maori patients in the emergency department, a very, very good paper. And so we just put that on the front cover. And then the final one is something similar for the indigenous peoples of Australia, which are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And we published some papers about inadequate or poor healthcare for that group. So a specialist journal can be campaigning if it's relevant to the audience, which is, emergency medicine audience. And I just want to share a comment I said earlier before we all started, that when I first went into editing with the British journal, the EMJ, one of the interview questions I had was, who was the most important person in the journal, the reader or the author? Now, I said both, but the answer was, according to the BMJ, is the reader. And it's a very narrow difference, but really you have to have a reader reading the journal, otherwise the journal doesn't exist. I actually think author and reader are equally important, but there is a message there. We have to make it relevant for the reader. I think another thing about being an editor is having editorial independence. One thing that the British Medical Journal group were very good about, and I mention them because the British Emergency General Journal, EMJ, was published by BMJ, and they insisted on editorial independence. And basically, when I edited the British Journal, we could publish what we wanted as long as it was legal. And I think editorial independence is important. And I just mentioned here, there's a story from Canada in 16 years ago. You may not have heard about it, but there was a big fight between the Canadian Medical Association and the editors of its journal about editorial independence. And I think the editor has to be independent. Now, with my role with the Australasian College, the college owned the journal, and I'm a fellow of that college. I used to sit on the college council. The Australasian College owns this journal, but when they asked me to become the editor, I insisted on editorial independence, and that's in my contract with them. And they were fine. They said, no problem at all. And all that means is, in reality, that the college can't publish anything they want in the journal. They still have to go through scrutiny and peer review, and they have to go through an editorial process. And if I have an author who wants to write something critical of the college in some way, as long as it's balanced and reasonable, then that can be published, and the college can't say no. And in my time with the journal, I can think of 2 or 3 papers which have gently criticised the college about something the college has done, and I've had no compunction in publishing it. And those papers actually led to debate and conversation within the college. So I think editorial independence is useful and should be supported if possible. Another thing about a journal is design. Now, when you're thinking about your journal, you need to think about how it looks, and because this develops for your reader and your authors, in essence, a brand. Now, this is not branding as in commercialism or capitalism, but it's about that feeling of the journal being a regular and reliable friend, in a way. Now, when I took over from the journal, the cover used to be like the one on the left with the bright red and the flashing lights. The first one I did, which was, I think it was February or April 2014, was the cover in the middle. And as you can see, they're quite radically different. And the cover on the left was the same cover in every issue of the journal. Now we put a slightly different image on the cover with a slightly different caption. And some of the images we put on the front have been quite stunning in the quality of them. But we get a picture from Wiley, from their picture library. We choose a picture relevant to a chosen paper. and the colouring goes with that. So, again, when I took over as editor, this was part of the negotiation with the college and with Wiley, that I was given some freedom about what it would look like. And again, there was no problem there. The Wiley were very supportive and the college were very supportive. So now the cover of the journal is always white and with a different image on the front of the cover. And then the one on the right is the color or the design we use for our Twitter site. And the colors, the blue and the green, were chosen very carefully because inside the journal, we put the papers into either a pale blue category or a pale green category. Also, when you're looking at design, certainly you need to think about the font, what sort of font you want, the size of the font. And if you're going to have a hard copy journal, you need to think about the quality of the paper. And similarly with the cover of the journal, you need to think about the quality of the cover. Is it thick card? Is it thin paper? Now, those are only relevant if you're going to have a hard copy paper, and I'll come back to hard copy shortly. But if you go for better quality paper and better quality covers, it's more expensive. It's as simple as that. And if you go for thin, very lightweight paper where the ink rubs off easily and it's a thin cover, that will be cheaper, but then the journal will not be as robust on a shelf. It's going to be sort of deteriorate a little bit quicker. So those are things to think about. Your social media design, that just needs to, again, fit with your brand and what you think your brand is for your journal. And that's up to you. But branding is a very significant, even if you only have an online presence without hard copy, you still have to have some branding for your online image. And you can go down the road of being very traditional just with a list of contents with no images, but I've decided to, as you see in the middle one, just to go with a very sharp image. And then the content is discussed on the first page inside the journal. Now, when you have a publisher, they give you all sorts of reports. Now, I get from Wiley 3 big reports a year. Now, I can't really share these with you because they are sort of commercially confident, but I can give you an idea of them. But we get very complex, detailed reports about the journal each year. We get a publisher's report. We get a bibliometric analysis, which is really detail and breakdown about the papers, the number of pages, and so forth. And it's really more interesting than it sounds. And then we get the metrics report. And this is where particularly researchers will be interested because of things like the impact factor. So we get from Wiley these big reports every year. They're about 30, each one's about 30 pages long. So they tell us exactly where the journal is tracking and how we're doing, really. And I find them incredibly interesting. The next ones will be due probably in about July or August of this year. So I want to talk about metrics. Everybody gets very excited about the impact factor, and particularly researchers like the impact factor. I can say honestly, in the 14 or 15 years I've been a journal editor, I have personally never worried about it as being editor of a journal. Because I think it's a false way to think about what a journal is for. And if you go back to my earlier comments and what the BMJs say is a journal has many functions. It can be a magazine, it can be a stimulation for debate, it can be an educator, it can be an opinion former, a campaigner. Those sort of papers are not reflected in an impact factor. It's only the research papers are impacted by the impact factor. We also have to think about how many people read a journal. Most readers of a journal are not researchers. Most readers of a journal are clinicians who are working very hard. They have busy professional lives and they have busy family lives, private lives. And a lot of them will read the journal at home or at work, They'll read a journal, they'll go through it, and they're not interested in impact factors. They're interested in the content of the journal. And particularly, they might be interested in an educational feature if you publish a paper on how to put in a chest drain, or if you publish something which is slightly controversial, such as racism against Maori in healthcare. So the impact factor is only one way that a journal is read. People online, people look at the first page, do they go to the second page, the clicks? And I think we have to think carefully about what we're trying to measure. So the impact factor is important, but as I say, it's only one part of how a journal can be measured. Now, the metrics we get from Wiley include all these listed here, and there's a few more. Now, I have to remind myself each year what each of these metrics are. But it's really quite interesting. We need to know how many people just read the first page of an article online, how many read right through to the end, the full thing, how many are downloaded. So it's more than just the impact factor. An interesting one at the very top there is the percentage of self-citation. Now, this is how often does a journal in its published papers get cited in those papers, self-citation. Now, there's a lot of debate about the relevance of self-citation. There is one school of thought that if there's too much self-citation, then a journal is promoting itself to improve its impact factor. Another school of thought is that self-citation implies that the articles the journal is publishing fits with what the readership want. Generally, with Wiley, if the self-citation is getting quite high, you'll get an alert from them saying your numbers are too high, you've got to bring the self-citation down. And certainly with the broader scheme of measuring impact factor, if self-citation gets too high, a journal can get like a red flag warning. And if it doesn't respond to that, then it can be taken off citation, off the impact factor ladder. So self-citation is an interesting metric because although it has good points from a publisher's point of view, they don't like it going too high. But those are a whole list of metrics that an editor will get from Wiley about a journal. There's another metric called altimetric. And if you certainly look at the EMA online, at any manuscript, you'll see you can see an information link. I'll show you in a second, take you to altimetric. And this is another set of metrics which have to be measured. And this is really what's getting reported outside of an academic journal, which is where impact factor falls down. What's being reported in Wikipedia or in a newspaper or on television or on the radio. What's being reported on Twitter or Facebook. And altimetric can pick those things up. And if I go into an altimetric page, this is what I see. And this is just a random paper. You see at the top there in the middle an AM score for a paper. You can click into that and you'll get these two boxes below with a lot more detail. I can see, for example, that for this particular paper, most of the inquiries have come from Australia. There have been a couple from Singapore and one which looks like probably Malaysia as well. And the boxes on the left where it says 18 tweets as 3 dimensions, you can click into those and get a lot more information about where the tweets are coming from, where they're going to. And the Mendeley is like a bookmark referencing system for academic research, very powerful tool. Excuse me. And I can click into that and see if Mendeley is bookmarked a paper as well. So there's all these other metrics which are very important for a journal outside of the impact factor. And this, when I said earlier, I don't really take the impact factor as the most important thing. These are the sort of things I find more interesting because I think it's reflecting the non-academic reader of the journal. And if I go into the Twitter section here where it says 18 tweeters, I can see who's tweeted, where those tweets are coming from. And that gives me a much more honest sort of feeling for what the readers are thinking of the journal. I want to talk about peer review. If you look at the box on the left, Richard Smith, who was a previous editor of the British Medical Journal, he was very skeptical about peer review. And this is going back 25 years. And, you know, he's made many comments about it over the years, but having said all that, he still thinks peer review is the best process we've got. For all its faults, it is still the best system we have. I don't think artificial intelligence will supplant it. And it's here to stay. And despite peer review being a bit flawed, it is the best we've got. And there are ways we can reduce the error in peer review. And I put the mention on the right about the scandal of poor medical research. This is from 1994, so nearly 30 years ago. And this was again saying a lot of the papers published are poor quality research. And so peer review can be done. You can make it better. And this is another paper about peer review. Again, it's from Richard Smith, but this is only 16 years old. And so how do we get around that? Well, if we look at my journal's website, the EMA, you can go into the website, you can see a contribute box, and you can click on any of these headings and we give you guidelines on how to do this. So we have guidelines for authors on how to write their paper and submit it. We have guidelines for peer reviewers to follow a process. And we have guidelines for our sub-editors. So we might have a sub-editor in pediatrics, and they have guidelines there on that as well. And also we have a box there you can see about open access as well. So for all the flaws of peer review, it is the best system we have. And the way to make it better is to have a structured process. And if you were to click on ours, you'll find some guidelines there on how to do that. And I have to say for this journal, the Australasian journal, the peer reviewing we get is very, very high standard. I get excellent reports from the reviewers, some of them very, very detailed, and these go back to the authors. And the papers come back and they're like different papers. You know, they are fantastic reviews that we get. So it's worth investing in training and guidelines on how to do peer review. I'd like to briefly talk about print and digital. Obviously, there is a move towards doing everything digital, and there are advantages to digital over print. Two big advantages is our cost and the environment. Print editions are more expensive, and our journal is actually published in Singapore. So it's then flown from Singapore to its readers. So you've got to think of the carbon footprint on that stuff, really. So if you go for print, it's a big decision. Some people say that print is dead, hard copy is dead, but they said that with Kindle books. And certainly in Australia, New Zealand and Britain, bookshops are reviving, and Kindle is not quite so big as it once was. So I'm not sure if print or hard copy is going to totally go away. What we're going to do with our journal, we will be phasing out print copy probably within the next couple of years. But those who want to buy a print copy, there will be an extra subscription. So we'll make it optional for people. And I suspect the majority of our readers will go digital only. But we have a feeling there's a core 10, 15, 20% who might decide to go for the hard copy, and that will be tailored to their subscription to do that. Talk about open access. This is a big subject. Basically, as you may know, the researchers can pay to get their paper published. The paper should still have to go through peer review, but the problem with open access is there are a few predatory journals around who will take your money, publish your journal, but you are not getting the infrastructure and support of a sort of established academic publishing house like Wiley. And now Wiley, we do have open access, and open access is possible. An EMA manuscript would cost you, I think it's about $3,500 to $4,000 US to go open access. So there is a cost there to the researchers. And the thing is, a lot of the research from small specialties like ours is not backed by big international grants or big academic research institutions. So that cost may be difficult to support. But certainly open access, I think, is here to stay, and I think it's a good thing. But the trick is that the manuscripts should still be peer-reviewed and be properly processed to show that they're good enough. If people go down the road of a predatory journal and paid $3,500, $4,000, $5,000 to get their paper published, then I think that is a bad thing, because there's no standard control, there's no peer review, and those papers could be absolute rubbish. In terms of papers being poor quality, let me just give you one guideline. Of all the manuscripts we get to the Australasian Journal, 50% are rejected immediately, and a further 10% are rejected a little bit later. So we have about a 40% acceptance rate. The British Medical Journal has about a 5% acceptance rate, and the Lancet, I think, is about 3 or 4%. And I suspect Nature is probably less than 1% acceptance rate. And those papers which are rejected immediately, they're rejected by me at first screening, is about 50%. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but basically they're just not very good. Simple as that. So open access is an opportunity for poor quality research to get published if it isn't done through a proper journal. Wiley has open access, and you can find those details on the Wiley website. Just for the record, last year we published 4 papers through open access. The year before that, I think it was 4, and they came from people who had large research grants, and they had decent backing to fund that payment. So multi-site, multi-center projects, really. So with publishing, I've talked about predator journals, but be very aware of fraud. Fraud is a big issue. The data submitted can be inaccurate. It can be made up data. Authors might dual publish, where they send a paper to 2 or 3 manuscripts, 2 or 3 journals. Now, when you submit a manuscript, you have to sign a form to say that this is the sole publication, but that doesn't always happen. And I can think of, in my not 17 years of being an editor, I think I've probably seen about 5 or 6 examples of dual publication. Also content stealing, which is plagiarism. Be very wary of a journal or a paper which has 20 authors on the paper. Every author should be able to list what their contribution is. And quite often the people in the middle are the ones who've contributed less. So if you've got 12 names on a paper, it's possible that 5, 6, and 7 may have done nothing, but be very aware that a long list of authors doesn't mean they've all contributed. And most journals now will ask for a breakdown of contribution. If an author has competing interests or things to declare, that's fine, as long as they declare it. So any conflict of interest has to be declared right at the beginning. Most journals have a way of checking for plagiarism. We use something called Authenticate. So every manuscript which is submitted is automatically screened by this software, and it just picks up stuff which looks dodgy. And if they find anything which seems a bit strange, then that gets referred to me, and we can investigate it. And there's another site called Retraction Watch, which is where comments made in papers or papers are actually retracted because they're found to have a problem with them. And there are many more ways of checking for fraud and so forth. But you have to be vigilant. Now, for editors, there is an organization called COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics. They're an international committee. I've joined them, and they have a huge resource and database of information for editors to go to where they think they've got a problem paper which may be fraudulent or false or just be plagiarism. Now, if you have a paper which is fraudulent or false, or you have a concern, the first thing to do is just write to the authors. Just go direct to them saying, "Dear author, I've picked up this concern in your paper. I just have some questions. Here are the questions. Please, can you give me an answer?" Simple as that. Now, if the authors are straight, they'll get back to you straight away and they'll give you an explanation. If you don't hear from them, there's probably something wrong. And what you can do with COPE is, once you've got a paper which has gone outside of your comfort zone or your experience, you can go to COPE and have a conversation with them. And they will tell you the next thing to do is, if you don't get a reply from the authors, is go to the author's institution where they work, right to the head of their hospital or their university, and let them sort it out. Because if there is a fraudulent paper, it brings down the reputation of the university. So I have actually had to use COPE directly for advice once. A lot of the time I've had advice from their website, and you can get it off their website. And they've been very helpful. But quite truly, in the world of emergency medicine, the true number of fraudulent papers is very, very, very small. But just be mindful that it is an issue. So really, I hope that's been interesting. I've tried to take you through a range of concepts and ideas, but ideally, a new editor should get some training, if possible. In talking about the impact factor, it's important for researchers and some universities, but there are more to metrics than the impact factor. And we have to measure how people read journals today, and not every reader of a journal is a researcher. Peer review is not perfect, it's the best we have, but have a structured system in place so people get consistency. Style and design, I think, in your brand is important. Try and define your brand and content. One thing about social media I haven't really said, if you use social media, now our journal, we only use Twitter, but social media is only about the message. It sends the message. It doesn't create the message. So you can use social media, Instagram, whatever the latest software is, or the latest TikTok, whatever it might be. But all it is, it's a means to get the message across. So your journal still has to get good content. Without the content, everything else is irrelevant. So please, please, please don't be sucked into the social media or the print and the design of your paper. It's all about the quality of the content, and you have to have material which your readers are interested in. Open access is good, but be mindful it can lead to poor research and predatory journals being published, and just be mindful of fraud and plagiarism and so on, and use COPE as your supporting organisation if you have a problem. So that's me, and I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the question and answer session later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hughes. Your talk is very inspiring and comprehensive. So